So I'm going to do either a longer one or maybe this will just have to be enough. I don't know. But from my perspective, I've had way too many people asking about applicant tracking systems and trying to get their resume past the applicant tracking system to be able to get a job at a tech company. And what I've noticed is that there's a lot of misconceptions and a lot of just false information being broadcast by people in HR. And I think I need to make a video on that in order to help people. And so I'm going to do that now. In case you're not aware, just to level the playing field a little bit, applicant tracking system is generally the automation and software used for applicants to be tracked and candidates to be considered for open jobs and roles. Many of them are just simply filing cabinets in that you submit yourself to an application and there's effectively, the user table, the job table, and the applications table in the database. And there's a giant query that says these people applied to these jobs with these applications. And that's basically what it comes down to. Unfortunately, those are the older systems. And if you want to read this particular book, you can this page here. It's very minimal, and I believe that to be intentional. My personal belief is that HR does not want people to know about the automation that exists because they know they would get in trouble if people knew that they were using it. And the biggest problem here is the subset of HR professionals that know that it's wrong. And so they actively go around and say that they don't even exist, even though they clearly do, either because they misunderstand how they're used or why they're used, or because they actively want to hide the fact that applicant tracking systems can be a black hole because it's, part of their business. Maybe they're selling, DIE, or maybe they're selling some sort of consulting that they just automate on the side, and they're trying to, in order for competitive intelligence or to build a moat for their business or whatever, they're trying to lie and say that these don't exist because they want to be the only ones that use them. And so as a result of that, I'm making this video to point out that that's wrong, but also to kind of educate and help people. And so one of the things that you have to understand with the applicant tracking system is that, like this says, it's basically a customer relationship management system, but it's a bit more in depth. You see, there are additional laws and regulations required for outreach. And if you're a third party, such as a third party staffing agency, you're going to have a much different applicant tracking system than if you were a company that was legitimately trying to hire people only for your own business, because they think of it as a sales opportunity. And they also don't consider themselves to have to follow a lot of the same laws and rules. And even though that's not the case, and it's absolutely illegal for them to do a lot of the discrimination that they do, they still get away with it because they play jurisdictional shell games with companies and so forth. And so as a result of that, people who are applying to jobs need to be aware that this automation actually does exist, and it's something that you need to take into account in your job search. I'm currently trapped in it myself at the moment. I have applied to many jobs, and I'm not getting a response, despite the fact that I have 25 years of experience in the industry. I've been a principal software development engineer. I've been a director of engineering with hiring authority at Fortune 50, and I've led hundreds of engineers at the same time. And so as a result of that, I have some minimal HR training. I was formerly trained as a hiring manager in multiple prior roles, and I was fully trained as a recruiter for an entire week in one of the roles that I was in, where I worked for an executive staffing firm where they hired me explicitly to work on the back end and work on their applicant tracking system and create a new version that included a candidate submission pipeline tracking system. And so, as a result of that, I have seen the code for the applicant tracking system. I am an expert on this because I have seen the code and I know how it works. I have deployed it. I have looked at it. I have run the tests. I have audited the database. I have audited the background tasks, and I've seen the WTFs in the code. So, generally, when people are actively looking for work, you are actually here at this stage where you are just looking for work, right? So, here's the deal. You're searching, you've got an open job, maybe you're searching, and maybe you're searching and you're not finding anything. So, you go in a loop, you're not hired anywhere, and you're just spinning your wheels around this work. Well, guess what? Maybe you do find an open role, right? So maybe an external sourcing recruiter contacts you if you're lucky. And maybe they don't dick you around, which is a big issue with sourcing recruiters, because most of the people that recruiters who are sourcing recruiters reach out to never actually land a job because of the racism and stuff that you have to deal with when somebody is out of India and they're talking to you about the job and you're based in America. Unfortunately, that's a problem, and it's something that I deal with every single day. But here's the deal. Maybe maybe you actually found it and you're direct applying. Maybe you're actually going through that process. You direct apply, you look at their process. Maybe it's too hard. Maybe it's too long. Maybe the process scares you away. So the applicant stops applying. Application failed. They don't get hired because they didn't apply. But maybe you actually did do the application successfully. Now you're in the applicant tracking system. Well, guess what? The modern applicant tracking systems are not just filing cabinets. They include multiple filters, multiple forms of automation, and will gladly reject you 3 seconds after you've submitted your resume. They can do that for knockout questions. Okay, well, guess what? The job application required application questions, and you answered them wrong. The most popular is Boolean. Maybe you did false and they expected true, or maybe you did true and they expected false. Either way, knockout questions are an accepted thing in HR, and it's something that everybody who works in HR understands and knows about and kind of hates. But they're useful because they filter down candidates and let the HR people look at the candidates that are maybe they actually meet the hard requirements. And as a result of that, unfortunately, we also have something called knockout filters, which is the questions that are asked of your resume and the other documentation that you submit that are not directly, explicitly asked you. So think of knockout questions as the explicit knockouts and the knockout filters as the implicit knockouts. Unfortunately, the implicit knockouts are varied, wide, and they exist in ways that I don't feel are fully fair. Yeah, they will filter your documents like your resume and your cover letter, unfortunately. And so they can even be set up so that if you don't submit a cover letter, all you are automatically rejected no matter what the content of your resume is. And I have personally seen this. I know this because I said I've seen the code. And so, as a result of that, you can also deal with timeouts. For example, if they are interested in you enough and you get past the initial stage and you get sent a communication email asking you to answer EEOC questions, those are the questions about your race, your sex, your gender, etc. And you don't reply to those, they can knock you out at that stage. This is something that I have also personally seen, and I hate it. Just so you know, most people will not reach out to you more than a set number of times. I'm not sure how much I'm allowed to say here, but I will say that if you get reached out to enough times and don't respond, they will put you on a system in some cases. And who knows, maybe they'll contact you in 6 months. I don't know. It depends on the system. But what it comes down to is you should start looking at this and start tracking the data so you can start correlating this for yourself. Because emails, maybe it gets caught by your spam filter. So you don't get a response, which means you don't get hired. You're not interviewed. Maybe the communication is by phone and you've got regulatory blocks because of your phone company not allowing that sort of thing. contact failure. Maybe texting is illegal and you didn't opt in, so they can't do that. So they're going to reject you because their system is poorly designed and poorly configured, and it because you didn't opt into texting, they're going to consider that a failure to contact and then knock you out of the system. So it doesn't matter what the contents of your resume are. These are all things that I'm personally against. These are all things that I personally hate exist. And these are all things that I wish didn't exist. But as you can see, I have personally mapped out this system based on all of my experience, and they exist. And so this is all to protect the actual company, because by the time you get through all of this, from the applicant tracking system, which is accessible by the internal recruiter or the person working in the recruiter role, the internal recruiter at that point now has to pour through all the resumes that are left. And so there are many recruiters who just sit there and they go through resumes constantly, even on the weekend, because that's their job. They're expected to do it. Maybe their salary, maybe they just have a lot of submissions to go through. Either way, the internal recruiter is trying to kind of trim down the amount of work they do as much as possible, which is why these applicant tracking filters exist, whether it's a knockout question or a knockout filter. It's them being, well, I don't want to say lazy, but I will say is that in many cases, knockout questions and knockout filters are poorly designed and actively contribute to harm and hurt the candidate experience to the degree where it's not worth it for the company to actively use them as part of their hiring process. And I firmly believe that knockout filters and knockout questions can actually be more costly than a simple process where you hire a recruiter and have them manually go through resumes without the help of these things. But let's just say you've gone through that process. They have an ATS set up. Now there is an applicant tracking system, and the internal recruiter is accessing it, and they're looking at everything. Let's just say that it was set up correctly. Let's just say that the knockout filters are reasonable. They're looking for somebody with a work visa that follows all the laws, and those were very minimal knockout questions. But they were there because of all the other things that can happen and all the people who are offshore who apply to jobs where they flat out have no chance of getting it, but they apply anyway because they literally cannot be held accountable for it. So let's just say it's all good, and maybe they turned off the knockout filters, and everything else is really set up well. In most cases, it's not. Let's just say that. Okay, well, guys, here's the rest of the process. They've got an application from a stellar candidate, and the recruiter says, "Hey, we should look at this person." They sends them off, the internal recruiter sends them off to human resources, or maybe they're directly contacting the hiring manager leadership, or maybe they're actually working directly with the hiring manager. Either way, the authority for this has to flow through that system at some point. And so what's happening there is the recruiter is working with the hiring manager or their leadership to be able to figure out who to shortlist for an interview. At that point, you actually have the interview. Now, the interview process is different at every company, but generally, based on my HR experience and based on my hiring manager experience, there are three different types of interviews. There's the behavioral interview. Are you a jerk? Are you an asshole? Are you somebody that people actually want to work with? Do you have the technical skills? Can you actually do the job? And it was also the interview feedback process, which can be considered a third thing in some ways, but generally it comes down to how you interact with the recruiters and everybody during the interview. If you were nice to the people in the interview, but you were a dick to the recruiter or everybody else, that's still going to count against you. And so as a result of that, consider the three big things there. Now, if you actually failed any of these, you are going into the failed bracket and you're not going to get hired. If you actually did pass, you're probably going to get an offer. And maybe the offer that they gave you was rejected by the company. I've been in situations where I've literally gotten an offer from a company, and then they called me the next day and said, "Ooh, look, our internal process says we can't actually offer that. We can't actually honor the thing that we wrote down." And at that point, they've got weak leadership, or they're unable to pay market wage, etc., and you're not going to get hired. But maybe you got an offer and your offer was rejected because the candidate rejected. Maybe they tried to lowball you. Maybe you went through the entire interview process citing very specific numbers because you're in a state with a pay transparency law and you expected those rates and those ranges to be respected, and they decided not to. So you rejected it out of anger. And because you're legally allowed to do that, guess what? You're not going to get hired. Oh, well, go on to the next one. But let's just say the offer is mutually accepted. Great. You're hired. So that's the entire process for interviewing and getting hired. And so the big issue here is that as a person who works in HR, they see a lot of resumes and they see a lot of applications. And that is why the internal recruiter is looking at the applicant tracking system and trying to filter out people as much as possible because well, they want good applications. They want people to apply to the job, but they only want the one person that will end up getting the job to actually apply. Everybody else is considered a waste product as part of the process. And so when you think about this, if they get 100 people applying to the job and they're only hiring for one person, 99% of that is waste. 99 people are completely wasting their time. And so, in order to optimize that and lower costs of the business, they add automation on the applicant tracking system. And so, as a result of this, you'll often find, if you go on LinkedIn, for example, there are people raging about the applicant tracking system who are very angry about it, and they should be. But there's also another interesting side of this. There's the people in HR who claim that this entire system doesn't even exist. Now, you might ask yourself, what do those people have to gain? Well, like I said before, they probably have a consulting business. They're probably selling classes. They're probably selling DIE stuff. And because they don't want people to know about this, they've decided to lie and actively make the claim that it does not exist. And so, as part of that, they've decided to either falsify the fact that it exists, or, and I'll be very clear here, they are not aware of it. They're just simply ignorant of it. And as a result, they do not know about this entire thing. And they legitimately believe that the applicant tracking system that they are accessing as the internal recruiter does not do any of this. Possibly because they are lower tier in the organization and do not have administrative control. In many cases, I've seen recruiters accessing these kind of systems who didn't even know that that rejection stuff was happening, because what happened was they weren't given the permissions to see that side of things. And so as a result of that, they were working on what they considered to be an applicant tracking system that was just a filing cabinet. But in reality, it was actively rejecting candidates that they never knew about. And so that is why these type of automation is bad. Because I personally feel like the recruiter should have full knowledge of who is rejected and why, and should be able to give that feedback. In fact, I think these applicant tracking systems would be better for companies if they explicitly listed the trigger and the reason and gave a plain text English, explain it like I'm five, reason for every single rejection. And I personally feel like when they're using these kind of automations, if they did that in a way that actually mandated that kind of transparency and we had some kind of law around it, the world would be better. Because at that point, we could hold companies accountable for using this kind of automation and actively call out when it's misconfigured or abused or being used to discriminate unfairly. And so, as a result of that, you need to be careful. If you see a recruiter claiming falsely that this doesn't exist, you need to be empathetic and realize that maybe they just don't know. Maybe they're just so junior in their career that they've never actually had access to the full spread of the applicant tracking system. And maybe they've got a senior title. Maybe they've been in it for 20 years. And maybe it just comes down to a business decision by the business not to let HR have access to that, which is unfortunate. And it's something that happens. But you have to understand that not every recruiter who makes the false claim that applicant tracking systems don't have knockout questions or knockout filters actually knows what they're saying. They could be saying it with honest intention to help people, but at the same time, just be completely ignorant of the code and how it runs. And so you have to be aware of that. At the end of the day, it's always better to not make assumptions. So don't get angry when you see this, but educate and make sure that people understand that these systems actually exist, because it's really critically important that we move past the false discussion that these don't exist when they do, and move on to why they exist and if they should exist, which I don't believe they do. And so every time we debate and troll each other online and talk about how applicant tracking systems are hard to get through, or maybe the HR is like, no, 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 they're not. This automation doesn't exist. Applicant tracking systems won't knock you out, is what they say. Guess what? They will. But the fact is, people are claiming falsely otherwise because they either want to protect something, such as their consulting business or whatever, or they're ignorant. And so we need to move on to a more enlightened path and actively start thinking about, well, why do they exist? Let's get away from the idea that they don't exist, because they clearly do. As I've mapped out here, knockout filters and knockout questions completely do exist. And start talking about why they exist, and start talking about why companies use them. And also keep in mind that a lot of perfectly legitimate companies will turn this stuff off because they want to be perceived as more inclusive. And that's great. But unfortunately, a lot of third-party recruiting agencies explicitly have this kind of code in their system to cut costs. And so you should understand that the ATS that you're applying to, the reason that it's a private instance just for that company isn't just for the security of the applications and everything else. It's also for liability by the ATS seller, because they do not want the liability of a filter gone wrong. For example, if they start to decide to, let's filter out all people of a specific race, or let's look at all the resumes, and if we detect a year that is over 10 years ago, automatically reject them. Unfortunately, I saw that last filter firsthand, and that was why I tried to push back on the automation that I saw at the role that I saw it in when I saw the code for an applicant tracking system. And the company decided that their profits are more important. And so when they decided to lay off people to cut costs, I was on that list because it was just simpler to get rid of the guy that was pushing back against the automation rather than remove the automation that was creating profits. And so one of the things that you should understand here is I'm not allowed to say the name of that company. I would work nothing more to make their name public and expose them. But because I was on the short list during their reduction in workforce, they could easily claim that I'm just a begruntled ex-employee. And so as a result of that, I don't have any power to help people. All I can do is move on and educate people around the general ideas of what I saw in a true, honest effort to help protect people and help people understand that this stuff exists. It's wrong. It should not be used. And as a result, the world will be better without it. But HR has already accepted the fact that knockout questions exist. And so I fully expect that knockout filters will be an acceptable part of the hiring process at some point. I don't like it, but that's just how it is. I don't have any control. So when somebody says to beat the ATS, maybe they're trying to pull your leg. Maybe they're trying to sell you something. And fact is, a lot of people do. But you can't make the claim that applicant tracking systems don't exist, because they clearly do. And you can't make the claim that applicant tracking filtering automation doesn't exist, because knockout questions are an accepted part of filtering for applications. So clearly that's automation. So you can't say that the filtering automation doesn't exist. You can make the claim that filtering based on the contents of your resume doesn't happen, but that's also false. And so one of the things that you have to understand is that people saying that may just not know what they're talking about. They may not have the technical experience. When I look online and I Google the term knockout filter, I get very different searches than I expect. And I suspect that there is a coordinated campaign to keep this information under wraps. Because whenever I talk to people about it, they generally make the same claims publicly that it doesn't exist, but in private, they're more than happy to admit that it happens. And so I don't know why that is. I suspect there might be some sort of compliance rule or something behind it. I don't know. I don't know enough about HR. But I do know, as a technologist and as somebody who writes code, that I personally have seen the code for knockout filters in applicant tracking and candidate pipeline systems. And I actively refused to perpetuate them, and I pushed back on their existence and asked that they be deleted. And in return for that, I ended up looking for a new work. So all I can do is accept the fact that reality is and move on. But this is how I see the hiring process as I've described. And so if you find yourself applying endlessly to a black hole, this is why. It's not that you're not skilled. It's not that you don't have the capabilities. It's because they don't want to hire based on the contents of either your submission, or they've added the knockout filters to such a degree that they don't want to accept anybody, which is unfortunate because that's also very common. You'll find that offshore recruiting firms that just want to collect resumes so they can present them to possible new candidates as, hey, we've got this person. Look at all the resumes that we've collected. We have all these people. We are so big and powerful. You should use us for your future headcount. Look at us. It's a sales tactic, sadly. And unfortunately, that is why you will often find companies posting fake tech jobs with the applicant tracking system set to filter out anybody. And unfortunately, all it is an attempt to collect resumes illegally. Yes, it's illegal. Yes, it's fraud. Yes, it violates so many laws. But you have to understand that these companies are offshore. They don't give a shit. And so as a result of that, you need to be careful who you apply to and what you apply to as well to protect yourself, because it's unfortunate, but that exists. And that's the world we live in. We live in an automated machine that's designed to reject you no matter how good your qualifications are. And I believe that the discussion should move towards why that exists and how that is allowed to exist. Because I believe that we should have greater transparency in the hiring process. I don't believe that this applicant tracking system map should exist. But unfortunately, it does. And it's something that we have to live with. And so, if we are going to move on and be better as a human civilization, we need to stop making the false claim that it doesn't exist and start looking at why it exists and the things that motivate companies to create them to cut costs. And understand that right now, the recruiting industry is also going through a weird thing. And it's interesting because I've watched the whole thing where the tech industry went under, then the recruiting industry went under, and then boom, now the tech industry is going under even worse. And what I think is happening, it might actually be something bigger, but I'm not going to get into that here. But what I will say is that I've been tracking the trends. I've been looking at the data, and based on the data and the things that I know, this is enabling people to fire recruiters. And that is why I think a lot of recruiters are against even mentioning they exist. They're afraid of perpetuating the idea that it exists because they're afraid of being replaced. And I'm sorry, but you've already been replaced. That's why it's so hard to get a recruiting job if you work in HR right now. Because all the offshore companies and all the offshore firms, all the staffing firms that bought out everything in 2021, 2020, 2022, etc., when they bought all those staffing firms, they folded them into their international stuff. And unfortunately, that's why everything's been so hard to apply, hard to get a job, etc. It's not that the laws don't protect Americans. It's that the laws aren't being followed. And so we need to have a bigger discussion about why knockout questions and knockout filters exist and if they're legally allowed, and have some kind of process where if a knockout question or knockout filter actually knocks somebody out of the candidacy process, they are explicitly told why. They should be told, hey, this filter triggered, here's the trigger. Here's the plain English description of that trigger. If you'd like to, talk to us about this, here's the email that you can apply to, or here's the phone number you can call. That's what I think should be happening if we allow these to exist and continue in the future. Unfortunately, most of the discussion right now is actually based on the false idea that they don't exist. You have a lot of people in HR getting angry at other people who are trying to help other people. And you've got people trying to scam because they aren't even aware of all this. So you have people who are selling courses and whatnot to beat the ATS, and maybe they're not even aware of knockout filters and knockout questions. Maybe they're just trying to run a scam and get people to pay for a shitty resume. Okay? But at the same time, you also have the people who are angry at those people who work in HR, who can see that the people selling these updated resumes and everything clearly don't have any HR experience and shouldn't be considered experts on anything HR. And so they're ranting and yelling about how this is not a thing and how applicant tracking systems are not beatable. They're just cabinets and so forth, because they themselves are not familiar with this kind of automation or the fact that it exists. And so you need to be very careful. This is a landmine, and that's why I'm making this video. I want to expose this. I want people to understand that this kind of automation does exist, that I do not believe it to be legal, and that we need to shift the focus from why is it so hard to get it, why is the applicant tracking system such a black hole, and explain it's a black hole because of illegal automation that discriminates against you based on race, because the hiring manager decided he only wanted to hire somebody with a specific visa status, or because you answered wrong to the question on what your sexuality was when they asked you if you were straight or heteronormative or not. These are the things that we need to think about. These are the things we need to talk about, because we cannot expose the injustice that is going on in the world unless we admit that it first is existing.